Hello, I'm Forrest Sawyer. Welcome to our series, Liberty. We live in a time of fast-breaking news, which seems very far from the 18th century world, the subject of this series. Yet if you pick up a newspaper on any given day, you'll see items very familiar to the people who launched this country. Issues like taxes, freedom of speech, and the big theme that runs through this entire series, power. The power that government has over our lives. This series covers a span of 25 extraordinary years, a period when Americans transformed themselves from subjects of a king to citizens of a separate nation. And on the way, they devised a totally new system of government. Nothing's more surprising than the beginnings of the conflict. The founding fathers, like George Washington, were wealthy patricians. The last thing they wanted was a revolution. Yet the rich and powerful came to lead this uprising, one which would ultimately turn their privileged society upside down. As in all history, at the time, nobody knew where they were going, and they certainly didn't know how everything would turn out. But without intending it, they came up with the most revolutionary idea of the modern world, the idea that without kings and noblemen, ordinary people could govern themselves.
In the 1760s, a young American doctor, Benjamin Rush, is touring England. He is a future signer of the Declaration of Independence, but on this sunny October day, as he is led into the throne room of King George III, his king, the independence of America could not be further from his mind.
I gaze for some time at the throne with emotions that I cannot describe. I ask my guide if it is common for strangers to sit on it. He tells me no, but upon my importuning him a good deal, I convince him to allow me the liberty. Accordingly, I advance towards the throne. I sit down on it. I am seized with a kind of awe. I feel as if I'm on top of a mountain. All men's passions, all men's hopes aspire to nothing higher than this throne.
Benjamin Rush, indeed all American colonists, consider themselves blessed to be part of the largest, most powerful empire in the world. The colonists revere their king and admire everything English. Wealthy Virginia planters send their children to England to be educated. New Yorkers read British books and British newspapers. In Boston, they drink their tea from Wedgwood cups imported from England. Britain has just defeated its traditional enemy, France, in a conflict that has spanned the globe. In North America, the French have been driven from Canada and much of the West. The colonists see this as a victory for their way of life. With British culture, civilization, and the protection of British military might, the colonial provinces of America look to a rosy future.
The future would bring freedom, it would bring prosperity, because it would be British. The tyrannical French and Spanish had been removed from the continent. How surprising this is to us. We don't think of this as the Great Division. Their view of the future seems naive, so different than what we knew their future would have been, which tells us something. What came was not expected, and it was certainly not desired. They were British, they wanted to be British, they were proud of being British. That they would 13 years later be declaring their independence is enormously paradoxical. It did not have to be, it should not have been, from their perspective. That it happened is a great mystery that needs to be explained.
In the 1760s, the 13 American colonies are an outpost of the British Empire. Most of North America is a wilderness inhabited by Indian tribes. A few dirt paths link the colonies. It takes 2 weeks to get a letter from Boston to New York, and most colonists have never traveled more than 30 miles from the place where they were born.
You wouldn't recognize America geographically or politically. It was a society strung out along the Atlantic seaboard. It was a totally rural society. There were only a handful of cities with as many as 10,000 people in them, New York being one, Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston.
Now, with the end of the Long War, vast new tracts of land open for exploitation. The American colonies have, more than ever, become the land of opportunity. No one sees this better than the future founding fathers. They all have great ambitions. George Washington, at 31, has recently married Martha Custis, an extremely wealthy widow. With a large tobacco plantation and a seat in the Virginia legislature, Washington is determined to become the richest and most influential man in Virginia. John Adams of Massachusetts, the second president of the future United States, is a struggling country lawyer.
I want to do something that will surprise the world. Something grand, wild, to cut a flash, to strike amazement, to catch the attention of everyone. Will it be some quick action or a slow, silent, imperceptible move? Shall I creep or shall I fly?
The most famous American in the world is Benjamin Franklin. He too has big plans. He is trying to convince the British government to establish a colony in the newly conquered territories to the west. He will be the principal landowner. Franklin offers a member of the cabinet a piece of the action.
An application is about to be made for a grant of land in the territory on the Ohio River. This land will soon be settled by large numbers of people from the neighboring provinces. One share will get you 40,000 acres and costs next to nothing. Shall I put your name down?
Franklin has made a fortune in the printing business and has now gone on to the gentlemanly pursuits of science and politics. At 57, he has outgrown the provincialism of the colonies and has moved to the center of the empire, London, England.
I was traveling in a country town last Sunday and thought back to New England, where a man might be thrown in jail for singing while walking down the street on the Sabbath. Here, I can go to an opera or play on Sunday, and it's not only singing, but fiddling and dancing. I look around for God's judgments, but I see no signs of them. The markets are filled with plenty, the cattle fat and strong, the fences and houses all in good repair. I am beginning to suspect that the deity is not nearly as angry at the offense of breaking the Sabbath as your average New England magistrate.
Franklin is Pennsylvania's unofficial ambassador to England. He is looking for some high office in the British government.
He had innumerable friends in England, in the intellectual world. His problem, of course, was that he was outside the inner circle of power within the country. He didn't mix on social terms with the people who exercised real power.
In Great Britain, real power is solidly in the hands of the aristocracy, men who owe their position not to merit and ability, but to family, their lineage. Franklin comes from very humble birth, the 10th son of a candle maker. He may have discovered the cause of lightning, he may be the darling of the Enlightenment, but to the nobility he is, and always will remain, a commoner.
He's an almanac maker, a chimney doctor, a printer's devil, an atheist, and the father of several bastards.
Like Franklin, all the future founding fathers are seen as insignificant provincials. The George Washingtons and John Hancocks may be the most powerful men in the colonies. They may run their huge estates and their colonial governments, but they are painfully aware that they are looked down upon by the ruling gentry of England.
They try to compensate for their uncertainty. They try to affect a certain refinement. They are very attentive to form and fashion, but they never get it quite right. And when the English gentry come, they make remarks about, well, they have fine carriages, but they don't have matched horses. And then when they have matched horses, they don't have the right saddlery. There's always another level. They're never getting it quite right, these Virginians.
To Charles Lawrence, London, August 10th, 1764. Sir, you will send me the following item and charge it to my account. 1 livery suit of worsted shag, of the enclosed color and lined with red wool. Make the coat with plain white buttons and a collar of red shag with a narrow lace around it. I must note that, in prior shipments, instead of sending me goods which are fashionable, you have often sent articles that could only have been worn by our forefathers in days of yore. And for these goods that you palm off on us, your prices are exorbitantly high. It will be impossible to continue to do business with you unless there is some alteration for the better. George Washington.
They know that by the standard of England, by the measure of England, they are not respected. They are not looked upon as great men. They are not looked upon as grandees. They are, at best, men of commercial wealth. And yet they have this pretension themselves within their society of their own self-importance. And this makes them uncomfortable when they confront England.
A sense of inferiority extends to all aspects of colonial life. American artists feel they must go to London to learn from the masters. They still try to copy the haughty pose of a Gainsborough portrait. But these Americans will never be part of the aristocratic world they aspire to. They will create a new world, and sooner than anyone back then would ever have predicted. London, spring of 1765. A debate in Parliament over what seems to be a very small shift in colonial policy. Running the overseas provinces has become extremely expensive. Parliament announces that for the first time, the Americans will pay a small tax, not to their local legislatures, but directly to England.
I think that's the first thing that one has to say, looking back on it, seeing now, as we must do, that this was the opening of something which was going to be very big and very important, is that nobody realised that at the time. The British government had a variety of bits of legislation in hand, dealing with a variety of problems, as governments do. This was one of them, a moderately prominent piece of legislative programme of 1765, tidying up various details of the administration of colonies, but it wasn't really a subject of vast interest. It was rather technical. It was extremely remote. If you had stopped the average man in the street and said, "What do you think about the Stamp Act, my man?" He would have said, "What?"
It is called the Stamp Act because taxed items will have to carry a stamp, paid for by the user. Test pressings are made, and the new tax is set to go into effect in the fall. It takes 6 weeks by sailing ship for news of the tax to cross the ocean. When it arrives, the news creates a firestorm up and down the continent. For the colonial elite, the men who run the local legislatures, the Stamp Act is an outrage. It seems to confirm their worst suspicions, that they are not respected in England, not worth even being consulted about this change in policy. George Washington is a delegate sitting in the Virginia legislature.
The Stamp Act, imposed on the colonies by the Parliament of Great Britain, is an ill-judged measure. Parliament has no right to put its hands into our pockets without our consent.
Even royal appointees like the highly regarded Thomas Hutchinson, Chief Justice of Massachusetts, are upset.
You must not deprive the colonies of their right to make laws for themselves. Parliament should only make laws necessary for the empire as a whole.
The larger meaning of their life was wrapped up in being Britons. They were proud not to be Dutch, not to be French, not to be Spanish colonists, but to be British colonists, and to have, for 150 years, taxed themselves, governed themselves, behaved just like independent Englishmen did, although they were living in America. Now suddenly the Stamp Act implied that they were going to be governed, taxed by a parliament a long way away in which they had no representatives. Now, the only people who were taxed without their consent in Britain were servants, people who didn't have any property, women, children. And so the Stamp Act seemed to Americans to reduce Americans to the same status as servants and women and all those dependent people who were civilly emasculated. That is, they didn't have any public role in their own governance.
George Washington and other colonial leaders clearly see what will become of them unless they take action.
A line should be drawn between Great Britain and the colonies, clearly establishing our rights. We must either assert our rights or submit and become tame and abject slaves, like the Negroes over whom we rule with such arbitrary sway.
This tax is going to touch everyone. It's probably one of the dumbest political acts in the history of government. They tax dice and cards. So the rowdiest group of people there are in the world, sailors in port with nothing to do, are going to be angry. They tax legal documents, which means that lawyers, the most articulate and argumentative people in America, are up in arms also.
If the stamp man tells you to kiss his ass, shall he get away with it and live? Don't let your courage cool, or a few bullies scare you. We've nothing to fear but slavery. Love your liberty and fight for it like men who know its value. Once lost, it will never, never be regained.
The question, in any case, was never the immediate amount of taxation that the British were asking of the colonists. The question was whether the British had the right to do it at all. We are talking about people with enormous sensitivity to the dangers of power. If you conceded the right to Parliament to tax, and if there was no check on it, no limit, it could go on indefinitely. You could be bled white. The power to tax was the power to destroy.
The colonial legislators send official petitions to the British Parliament, petitions that are completely ignored.
The colonists had been saved from the spectre of the French and Indians, and there certainly were a lot of people in Britain who thought that they should be properly grateful for all this effort that had been expended on their behalf, mostly at the expense of the British taxpayer, and that it wasn't unreasonable that they should pay a modest share, a great deal less than 100%, of the cost of imperial defence in the future.
The Stamp Act was a bad idea, but what could you do? That was the problem. Massachusetts came up with the answer, and it was a very good answer, a very simple answer. August 14, an effigy of the Stamp Man appears, hanging from what became Liberty Tree. Mobs collected, they bring coercion on him. In short, they forced the Stamp Man, Andrew Oliver, to resign. Now, if you got one man to resign, if the Stamp Act stamps were not going to be distributed, well, the act couldn't be put into effect.
The popular fury spreads. Thomas Hutchinson, Chief Justice of Massachusetts, is a passionate believer in law and order. Privately, he is against the stamp tax. Publicly, he makes it clear that he intends to enforce it. On August 26, 1765, a mob assembles outside his house, one of the most elegant in Boston. Hutchinson and his family have just finished high tea. Hutchinson escapes with his life and little else.
Hutchinson thought the Stamp Act was a very bad policy, but it wouldn't have crossed his mind that you therefore would resist it, that you'd resist it with violence. It was unthinkable.
Everyone will suffer if the peace and order in the community are destroyed. I hope everyone will see how easily the people may be duped, inflamed, and carried away with madness.
The intimidation of royal officials spreads to other colonies. Would-be stamp distributors are attacked. Stamp paper is seized when it arrives from England. Colonial leaders propose a joint boycott of British goods. A Philadelphia lawyer, John Dickinson, supports this idea.
The taxes and duties imposed on us by Parliament must be instantly opposed. The only effective opposition is through the concerted efforts of all the provinces. By uniting, we stand. By dividing, we fall.
In faraway London, Benjamin Franklin is surprised by the fervor of colonial reaction to the tax. Moreover, the crisis is interfering with important business he has before the government. He lobbies for the repeal of the Stamp Act. He reminds the parliamentary committee that the colonies are England's biggest market.
Our buying your manufactured goods depends very much on our affection for you. Pride will induce Americans like me to wear our old clothes. And when we buy new clothes, they will be made by us.
Franklin has powerful allies in Parliament, among them Edmund Burke.
What are we doing with our constant insisting on taxing the Americans? We're not getting any revenue from them. Instead, we're pushing them to disorder and disobedience. You can wade up to your eyes in blood and you'll be back where you started, with no revenue. We make money from trade, not taxes. Let the Americans tax themselves.
The pressure brings results. In February 1766, Parliament repeals the stamp tax. Throughout the 13 colonies, there is a sigh of relief. Americans look around the world and think how lucky they are to be the subjects of King George III. In a time when the French king regards himself as the direct representative of God on earth, when the Spanish king can tax his subjects without limit, and Catherine the Great of Russia deals with political opponents by cutting off their heads and displaying them at the end of a stake, the British king stands alone.
The pride, the glory of Britain, the direct end of its constitution, is political liberty.
All through the 1760s, a steady stream of immigrants will arrive in the New World in search of their fortunes. One such visitor is the son of an English sheep farmer, Nicholas Cresswell. He keeps a detailed diary recording his impressions of his travels.
Americans in general are good-natured and agreeable, but confoundedly lazy. Although they come from different countries, it is remarkable they speak English better than the English do. Except, of course, for the New Englanders, who have a sort of whining cadence that I find hard to describe. They're tall and graceful, particularly the women, who are remarkably well-shaped. But they all have very bad teeth, decayed by the time they're 25. It is perhaps the hot bread they bake at every meal. The growth in population of this country is amazing. With the emigration from Europe, they are said to double their numbers every 16 years. Anyone with the least spark of industry can support a family. No one fears poverty here.
The American colonies, with their vast tracts of land, are extremely valuable to England. Their forests supply the tall, straight pine trees that become the masts for Britain's sailing ships. The farms and plantations export food and tobacco to England. Americans import virtually all finished goods from England. It is an arrangement that benefits everyone. But there are those in the mother country who fear that